And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Today, I have the pleasure of having Bobby Azarian on the Zoom Out show. Welcome, Bobby.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Great, great. Thank you. So, Bobby is the author of a new book called Romance of Reality: How the Universe Self Organizes Itself to Create Complexity, Life, and Cosmos. Or maybe I got the title slightly wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty close.
Yeah,
How the
great, great.
universe organizes itself to create life, consciousness, and cosmic complexity.
Great. Life consciousness and cosmic complexity. Love it. So Bobby is a neuroscientist, and he has also dipped his toes into complexity science and cybernetics. He has been a science journalist, and in his recent book, he's bringing together various theories from neuroscience, from complexity science, from evolutionary biology, and lots of other disciplines, and putting forward a very interesting and fascinating and bold hypothesis about the universe and the nature of consciousness. We're going to have a quick chat about his book and the framework and the ideas that Bobby brings together. But ultimately, the purpose of today is to dip our toes into how can we apply complexity science and neuroscience and cybernetics and these ideas into organizations, and how companies and organizations behave on a longer scale time spans. What do you think, Bobby?
I think it's great. I don't usually get to talk about organizations and some of this higher level stuff, usually just because the book just came out, focusing on sort of evolutionary theory and the more fundamentals, thermodynamics, stuff like that. So it'll be nice to apply it to organizations.
Sounds good. I'm super excited about it. So to get started, let's have a quick conversation about emergence versus reductionism. So what is reductionism and what's emergence?
So, reductionism is one of our most successful methods of science. And it basically says that to understand systems, we need to break them down to their simplest components so we can see how the parts act in isolation. And reductionism is one of the best methods of science. To understand a system, you have to understand the parts that make it up. The problem is that the reductionist method was so successful that it created something like a reductionist ideology or a worldview. And that worldview basically said that we're nothing more than particles. It kind of reduces humans to only being these aggregates of particles following these mathematical trajectories. And it seemed to deny the existence and causal power of living organisms, of agents, and
Mhm.
to sort of ignore the phenomenon of consciousness. And so, what the emergence paradigm says is that it's not only how the parts act in isolation that are important, but how they interact with each other and form a larger integrated system. So, you want to analyze the components, but you want to analyze the system at this holistic level. And that gives you a lot more information than you would get from just the reductionist method
Mm.
alone. And the reason looking at this is important is because the evolutionary story is one of these a story of major evolutionary transitions where things come together to make these larger functional entities. And those can be molecules coming together to make a living organism, or it can be organisms coming together to make a society or a corporation. And even at a higher level, now we're seeing all of the people on Earth coming together, connected by the internet and social media and blockchain systems to make something like a global brain. And I think that's an accurate analogy because humans exchanging information, the dynamics of that look very similar to the way neurons exchange information in the brain. And so we can use the brain as a model of society and use the biological organism as a model of this entire planetary system. And that can give us insights that we wouldn't have from the reductionist method and allow us to predict emergent phenomenon better.
Mhm. So there was a lot of ground to cover. Love it. Let's unpack it a little bit. So if I could go back to reductionism versus emergence, the there's two fundamental differences, one of a philosophical level and one of a practical level. So on a practical level, could we say that when you are trying to understand something, uh, understand the system, the reductionist approach is to break that system down to its part and understand the parts, and then you roll back your understanding. Versus if we think holistically and we have a more emergence lens, we would look at the system, how it behaves or how it interacts with its environment, and based on its interactions with its broader environment outside, by looking outside the system, not inside the system, it's better to understand its properties and how it behaves. Is that true?
Yes, that's right, and I think it was important, to add that piece about the environment. I kind of left that out. It's also about how these systems are interacting with the environment because no living system or no organization or city, is isolated from its environment, and the environment, in some cases, is sort of like an extension of that organism or system, and so it's really important, to consider that, the relationships of all these things together.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And the second question that comes is, well, what's the boundaries of the organism or organization or a system, right? For
Yeah.
example, me as a person, am I a unit on my own, or am I a unit with my mobile in my hand, right?
Yeah.
That's going to extend the boundaries of me and change the way that I behave and the way I function in my environment, right?
Absolutely. So there is a barrier, that makes you who you are. And there's a term from the computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence community called a Markov blanket. And basically, a Markov blanket um, separates internal states of the system from the external states of the world. And so it's nice to have that concept for a single celled organism. You have the cellular membrane. So you have like a lipid, a fatty membrane that surrounds, like keeps all the things in the inside. And for a human, it's our integumentary system. So our skin, different. Uh, there's a layer that holds us together, and that's really nice because then you can talk about a system as one thing, but truly there is no clear boundary. So couple examples, the extended phenotype was an example given by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene.
Sorry,
So,
what's a phenotype?
so a phenotype is the expression of a gene. So,
Okay,
for example, you could have a
turning it
gene,
on or off.
yeah, and you can have a gene that codes for so like blue eyes or brown eyes. So like the gene would talk about the actual chromosomes, but the phenotype would be the expression. So it'd be the actual color of the eye.
So we
And
may
so
have all those genes, but they may be off, and the phenotype is how they're organized together, right?
the phenotype is how the genes are expressed. So
Mm,
every trait that you have would be a phenotype
okay.
that corresponds to a gene in your genome. And
Mm,
yes, they can be, turned off and on. Um, and what Richard Dawkins pointed out is that beavers will build dams instinctually. So it's not something they learn from their parents. You can, raise a beaver in isolation and it will do this naturally. So the idea is that the beaver dam is an extension of the organism itself because the genome codes for that structure. And so already you see this line between the organism and the outside environment start to blur. Then a concept that came out of that concept, which you already alluded to, was the extended mind. And the extended mind, David Chalmers is a philosopher well known for articulating this idea. But your phone is an extension of your brain. It's additional memory. And anytime we have some problem that we can't solve, let's say our car breaks down, we're on the
mm.
side of the road, we don't know how to change a tire, we look it up on YouTube, suddenly we're a mechanic. So it's yeah, the planetary system itself um, is kind of like one super organism, one
Mhm.
cybernetic system. And so the atmosphere, the temperature, all of those things are regulated by life and
Mhm.
sort of part of the living system.
Absolutely love it. So when we talk about reductionism versus emergence, we talked about the practical, how it could be different, but on a philosophical level, I think that's also important, as you mentioned, because if we say we are no more than we apply reductionism until the end, the particles and quantum mechanics, and we are nothing more than the particles moving. Yeah, maybe, but what happens to the causal power and what happens to free will? And then it comes to things like when an organism behave. So, for example, when a beaver decides to build a dam, is it just the movement of the particles causing him to build a dam, or is it his agency? So maybe there's both. For example, there is a level of free will, for example, where he's building the dam or what type of dam or which wood he chooses, but the fact that he wants to build his dam is in his genome. But even that's not necessarily reducing all the way down to the particles. It's reducing a little bit, but there is still causal power maybe on the phenotype level. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah, that's really perceptive. So, you can have different, levels of reductionism, and a lot of times some scientists consider themselves reductionists, and they might be an evolutionary biologist, and they're thinking about, we can talk about all of this stuff in terms of genes. But if you take reductionism to, if you really take it seriously, then even genes are sort of epiphenomenon. It's called basically any system that so an epiphenomenon would be something that doesn't have causal power, but it might look like it does at this level, but it's really just a story of particles
Mhm.
interacting and bumping into each other. And if we could understand the system at that level, if we could see every particle, and with the laws of classical mechanics, we could kind of figure out what's going on, and predict what's going to happen.
Mhm.
It's been shown that that's wrong in a number of ways, but basically, what we need to understand, and it really becomes important with the phenomenon of life, is that these particles come together to form these larger units, and then those larger units are adapting to the environment. And as they adapt to the environment, they're basically acquiring information about the
Mhm.
environment. And there's nothing in addition to the matter that makes up the system. There's no, magical element that comes in and gives free agency.
Mhm.
But in a way, there is. So what happens is um, basically stored in these relationships between these particles that are held together by chemical bonds, and at higher levels um, by these other relationships. Um, Information is encoded in these patterns of activity,
Mhm.
and the information has causal power at these higher levels, such that brains are really doing the work and not the atoms that make up the brain. And when you start to analyze these systems at these different levels, information theory applied to neuroscience is showing that there is this emergent causal power that arises at these higher levels.
Mhm.
So even if we could do this complete reductionist analysis, it wouldn't give us what we would need to try to predict the future of society, for example, or what a person might do. And those things can't be predicted perfectly because living systems do have this chaotic component. They're
Yeah.
not exactly like chaotic inanimate systems, but basically small differences can get amplified, and you can see, these this this phenomenon where you have like tipping points, and like suddenly like a small change gets amplified and you see this global change. But you can predict these things with a certain amount of statistical certainty if you know information about, for example, someone's genome or their connectome, the way all of their neurons are connected. But even that won't tell you everything because there's
Yeah.
psychological phenomenon at a higher level.
Mhm.
And so really the job of science is to model all these systems at all these different levels,
Hmm.
because it's really the way they add up, to tell us everything that's key. And we already see this with the higher sciences. I mean, if
Yeah,
reductionism was true, we could just get rid of all the higher sciences and talk about particle physics. But
exactly.
so even before we had this philosophy of emergence, it was already reflected in the division of the sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, on a philosophical level, yeah, good to talk about it. But on a practical scientific level, we shouldn't even get there because you got maybe three variables. You can model it and simulate it. When you get to four variables, five variables, that's gonna happen, right? Um, yeah. So in practice, we all use emergence, and we don't really use reductionism in science. So actually, there's a few really good points that you brought up. So what was I going to say? With yeah, causal power. So causal power comes from information and computation, right? But the question that comes to my mind is it only the type of information and computation that life does? So can you think of any complex adaptive system that doesn't have components which are alive but has causal power? I was trying to think about some, but I couldn't really, nothing came to my mind.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a bit complicated. Our artificial computer systems, you can make something like an adaptive system. But whenever I talk about that, I always point out that you need to have life to create those systems. They don't emerge on their own. So those mimic some of the properties of life. But I would argue that we haven't made truly uh, like true complex adaptive systems that are artificial yet. And
Mm,
the day we do that is the day we see um, a new kind of intelligence emerge in
mm,
these artificial intelligence is something closer to general intelligence.
mhm,
And there's an emerging theory of consciousness coming out of neuroscience called integrated information theory. And it basically says to have this causal power that we're talking about, there needs to be a pretty specific, um, I would say, a structure of connectivity where all of the elements are kind of interacting and influencing each other. And right now, our artificial systems just don't have that
mm,
kind of hardware. But there is neuromorphic hardware. There's a lot of excitement
mhm,
about that because it duplicates biological structure more closely. So it's not the case that we can't duplicate, agency in
mhm,
artificial systems. It may be possible, but it's probably really hard, and we need to look to
mm.
biological systems in order to figure out how to do that.
That's interesting. So even if we do manage to replicate it, we are also part of the equation, right? Which is very fascinating. So it makes me wonder, we're getting a little bit off track, but this is interesting. Like the weather system on Jupiter, like that
Mhm.
big cyclone, that's not a complex adaptive system, or is it?
No, I wouldn't say the weather
It's not.
system is, but it is basically an example of a system that's kind of at the boundary between inanimate systems and living systems. So in the book, I talk about these things called dissipative structures,
Mm,
and examples of those are like tornadoes or hurricanes or whirlpools. And these things emerge spontaneously when there's some kind of gradient where the system is out of equilibrium and these cyclical structures emerge to collapse that gradient. And um, it's now thought that this is kind of the way life emerged. You had this chemical system that was a metabolic system that was basically opening up flow paths for planetary energy that had built up on Earth and had nowhere to flow. And the idea is that life kind of creates this new um, channel for energy flow that is realized by organic chemistry.
That was one of my aha moments as I was reading your book. By the way, the book is absolutely amazing, and it's I would say many years that I haven't read a science book that I actually learned stuff from. So kudos, really good work, Bobby.
That's a great compliment.
And
Thank you.
I highly recommend it to everyone to check it out. So one of my aha moments was I always had a problem consolidating thermodynamics and entropy with life, and how does it really work? And once you talked about, well, it's in a closed system, and the boundaries of the system and dissipative structures and things like that, and how we sometimes apply entropy and the second law of thermodynamics to the entire universe. And do you really know, is it a closed system or not a closed system? There's lots of assumptions based on these things that some scientists say as facts, but those things which sounds like facts, they're based on some assumptions that are unvalidated empirically. So yeah, that was really interesting, and I liked it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it is a mistake to apply the second law as conceived by statistical mechanics, because there's different versions of the second law. So I guess the first version of the second law was more about the dispersion of heat and energy, and then the statistical interpretation started talking more about disorder. And those interpretations are related, but so the creator of statistical mechanics, or one of the founders, was named Ludwig Boltzmann, and his model to understand this tendency towards disorder was based on a gas in a closed box. And so basically, the second law, or this version of the second law, says that if you have these molecules in this ordered configuration and they're all moving around randomly, then the system will just naturally tend towards a more disordered pattern, because there's way more states that look disordered than there are to patterned compared to patterned configurations. Um, but this was based on this idea of molecular chaos, and the theory was called the H theorem. So in Boltzmann's model, when the particles interact with each other, they stay uncorrelated, so they don't form any aggregates, and that's different than in the real world. You have, like, with life, you have all of these molecules bound together by all of these chemical forces. So the other thing it ignored was gravity. So you have a gas in a box. The effective gravity is negligible.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's a mistake to apply it as to the universe as a whole. And
Absolutely.
in the book, I tell this kind of story that life is kind of evading this tendency towards disorder. It's not evading the second law, really, depending on which version of the second law you're talking about, because basically, to evade disorder, it can maintain its ordered state if it can find energy from the environment, and it uses that energy to do work, and that
Mhm.
work is sustaining itself against entropic decay. But in
Yeah.
using that energy, it disperses the energy. So that's another form of entropy creation. So entropy is still going up, but we see that
There's
it's
energy
not.
coming in.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not really disorder when you dissipate
Yeah.
energy. I think it's wrong to say that it's disorder in all
Mhm.
contexts. So the universe can
Yes.
grow more and more organized. A lot of times people say locally it grows ordered, but overall it's growing more disordered. I don't think
Mhm.
that's right either, because this local pocket of order can
Mhm.
expand pretty much infinitely, as long as the system can continue to find new sources of free energy in the environment. And there's an ocean of free energy
Yeah.
out there waiting to be unlocked by life.
Yeah, exactly. And there's other questions like, is the universe infinite? Well, if it's infinite, it does have infinite free energy. Even if disorder goes infinite, sorry, even if unusable energy goes infinitely, you still can increase it forever and still create more and more complexity. But
Yeah.
one other interesting thing was with life. I really like, in your book you don't use the word dying. You say thermodynamic equilibrium instead of which is
Yeah.
I found it fascinating, because yeah, it is. So dying is a way becoming going towards the thermodynamic equilibrium, and if you want to evade thermodynamic equilibrium, basically means you want to stay alive, right?
Yes. So, yeah, the reason it's helpful to kind of frame it this way is because I guess traditionally we try to think about life and evolution, and we have this concept of survival of the fittest. And we think like the fittest organisms survive, but what does it mean to be fit? And it's kind
Hmm.
of a circular or tautological explanation where we say, what's fit? Well, the best at staying alive. Who are the best at staying alive?
The
Well, the ones that
fittest.
are most fit. So this really frames it, anchors it in thermodynamics and says fitness has to do with, at least at first, being able to extract free energy from the environment, energy that the system can use to sustain itself. And for us, it's food. For plants,
Hmm.
it's extracting sunlight, but for animals, it's food. And basically, if we starve to death, the system will die, and then it will start to decay, and we'll see the second law of thermodynamics, or at least again the statistical version, kick in, and the system will go to equilibrium. So in this context, equilibrium is just this state of um, no pattern, and it gets a bit confusing because
Hmm.
dynamic equilibrium, which sounds very similar, is often used to talk about an ordered persistent state by like ecologists, for example. So yeah, it's important to kind of specify that thermodynamic equilibrium is this state
It's
of death
different.
and decay, but
Hmm.
systems can be in dynamic equilibrium with the environment, which is basically a non-equilibrium equilibrium.
Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah,
it's a self-sustaining loop. It's a different type of equilibrium, not a thermodynamic.
exactly.
Absolutely. So now let's try to apply some of these ideas to social organisms and companies and yeah, those bigger ideas. So
Great.
is what's a superorganism? Because I always have this conundrum. Well, is an organization a superorganism or is it just a complex adaptive system? But first, what is a superorganism?
Yeah, it really depends on how you define these terms, and I don't think
Hmm.
there are any clear definitions. Some biologists like to define an organism in a very specific way.
Hmm.
So, you an organism is an adaptive system. So, you can have complex adaptive systems at higher levels. You can have a society that I think, no one would argue that a society isn't a complex adaptive system. We see these similar dynamics at these higher levels in the ecosystem.
Hmm.
Really, all systems that are living or are either part of the living network are these complex adaptive systems. But someone might say, well, an organism is something that can make copies of itself, and then those copies can compete and then be acted on by natural selection. And so, if that more specific definition, it might filter out some of these higher level complex adaptive systems. But even successful societies or successful companies can, when they're successful or not, spread overseas, make copies of themselves, and natural selection can act on these higher level systems. So
Hmm.
whether you consider a corporation a superorganism or not is really a semantic issue.
Hmm.
I don't think it's that important. I think it's a good term also. It's something that people understand. It might be a little bit easier to understand
Yeah.
than saying a complex adaptive system because everyone knows what an organism is. And
Yes.
plus it sounds kind of cool. You're like, oh wow, it's a
Yeah.
superorganism. And
So could you?
there's always blowback when you're using like terms that are kind of like sensationalized, but I think it's a perfectly good term. And
Mhm.
I think we're learning what an organism is when we start to look at, these complex adaptive systems at all these different levels.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So yeah, the nature of an organism is probably best understood as, the dynamics that we see at all of these different scales.
Mm. So, in other words, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's say a superorganism is a group of individual organisms that are together behaving also like an organism, like an ant colony, for example. It evades threats, it gathers information, sorry, it gathers food or energy, It moves, it can move, it can reproduce, and pretty much almost all the properties that organisms do. But as you said, the Markov blanket of it is not as clear as a skin. It's a conceptual Markov blanket, the boundaries of that superorganism. But so
Yeah,
if we
that's a very
consider,
good point. Yeah.
yeah,
Ant colony is a good example because ants show this behavior where when they need to get from point A to point B and there's no bridge, they will form a bridge with their bodies that will
mhm,
allow the ants to crawl over each other and make it to the other side. So it really looks like this superorganism. And
mhm,
the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, um, really respected biologist who passed away just a few years ago. He wrote a book called Superorganism, and he studied these ant colonies and really saw how they acted like this integrated whole. Um,
mhm,
so yeah, the Markov blanket point was really cool too because you're exactly right. Like if there is this superorganism at the higher level, what's the Markov blanket? What's holding it together?
mhm,
And at least with human societies, what I argue in the book is that the emergence of a worldview plays the role of something like a Markov blanket, because the worldview is what binds us together under a common goal and
mhm.
basically organizes a society.
Absolutely, I like it. Let's come back to that shared goal in a second. Uh, if we think about superorganisms as human social structures being superorganisms, again, I think that what makes it harder to understand and conceptualize is, let's say we have a company, right? That company is a superorganism, and we have a family. That family is also a superorganism. But then you could have two people from this family working on the same company and two people working in a different company. Or you can have multinational corporations, like the country itself. You can think of it as a superorganism, but then you have multinational organizations that span across multiple countries, and there's like overlapping Markov blankets depending on how you want to look at your object of interest, basically, which makes it a little bit harder to understand and yeah, and get your head around, I would say.
Absolutely. But there are people out there trying to understand this. So, one very prominent neuroscientist is Carl Friston, and he has this Bayesian brain hypothesis, which has been extended as the free energy principle,
Mhm,
and basically talks about what systems have to do in order to persist against this, tendency toward
mhm,
disorder to survive. And basically, it argues that the system will have to basically be able to predict the world
mhm,
and minimize its prediction error. So
mhm,
it's always trying to predict the world um, better, and they've applied the mathematics that they use to talk about organisms and these traditional Markov blankets to these higher level adaptive systems like societies, and they show
mhm,
that they have very similar dynamics, and that these societies as a whole, or even corporations, I imagine, are kind of doing the same thing, trying to predict the world, and can be understood mathematically as minimizing their prediction error.
I love it, because that brings us to the next topic of, if an organization is a superorganism and it's doing computation and trying to predict the world, and it's doing information processing, and as you mentioned earlier, it could be integrating information. Does it have causal power independent of the individual people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but so backing up to what I said before about talking about these higher level complex adaptive systems as superorganisms. So I think the way we need to look at it is that there's a pattern, there's a functional pattern that's being realized at these different scales, and that's called multiple realizability.
Hmm.
And so you have the similar or the same phenomenon being recognized at different scales and on different substrates. So it's also called substrate independence. But there are going to be differences at each level because there are novel properties that emerge at these higher levels. So I think one
Mhm.
useful tool of complexity science is we get to look at these different levels. We can see how they all share properties of complex adaptive systems, but also that they have differences. So if someone
Mhm.
wants to make a good case that something at a higher level is a complex adaptive system, but doesn't deserve the name superorganism, then I would be totally with that. So it's not so important
Mhm.
the words we use, as long as we know how we're using those words and we
Mhm.
define this larger context. But so to answer your question, I think these higher level systems sometimes they haven't evolved to have the sophisticated organization that we see in
Mhm.
organisms, and they might not
Okay.
have all of the same causal powers.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean they can't if a corporation gets sufficiently complex, or at the
Mhm.
level of something like a global brain, you start to see this integration that
Mhm.
starts to rival the levels of information integration that we see in biological organisms.
Yeah, I love it. So, okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, what you're saying is, well, we have different types of causal power. If we talk about causally decoupled agency, so that means like a human or like a person who has agency, which is one level above the agency of our collective cells. That's one thing, but which can be achieved, as you said in your book, based on certain types of feedback loops that we have in brain, and not all organisms, not all animals have those types of feedback loops. But if we talk about the superorganism, yeah, maybe they have, but maybe they don't. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because the reason that this question came to my mind was I was thinking, well, is the work that I'm trying to do in companies futile, right? If the company organization itself has a causal power, it doesn't really matter how much I try if the organization doesn't want what I want to do. But at the same time, based on what you said, it doesn't really matter, because even if the organization doesn't have causal power, there are so many variables at play that it has still the same effect, whether it does causal power or not causal power. My will is a small um, arrow, as small power, and I'm just a cog in a machine as well.
Yeah, so it's another complicated topic, but I'm glad you brought it up. I talk about this concept of causal decoupling in some of the later chapters where we talk about consciousness. There's this concept of a statistical ghost that has emerged in some of the information complexity literature. So the idea is that you have this statistical activity in the brain where the activity seems to be causally decoupled from the actual components of the brain. There's nothing mystical or supernatural there, of course, but the activity isn't bound to the components in the way that it is maybe in lower level systems. But that that concept's just starting to be understood. So whether you have something like that, at a corporation, I would think probably not. It's probably something that emerges at this higher level, like potentially the global brain
Mhm.
could have something like a global mind or a global consciousness. I don't think it has it at the moment. I think it is processing information at this higher level, so you could see it as an unconscious mind, but I don't think it has a conscious mind. Um, but as you said, yeah, I think you can always affect what's at the higher level through these bottom up processes.
Mhm.
So, um, with living systems and with corporations, you have hierarchy. So, you have this division of labor where you have, components that are interacting, but then you have this, next layer that might, play the role of something like an executive function in the brain. So, the prefrontal cortex
Mhm.
is a newer part of the brain evolutionarily, and it's really associated with the things that correspond to human intelligence. It's what makes us so unique. So, executive control is our ability to regulate ourselves, regulate our emotions, and make high level decisions when we're faced with a problem that we don't have a stored answer for. So a lot of the times we go through life and we're just acting like in this reflex like way, like when we drive to the store or get up in the morning, we don't think about everything we do. But when we're faced with a problem that requires a decision that isn't something that we've encountered in the past, we have to engage these, higher level cognitive systems. And so it's very useful to have this executive control because the decision might not have an easy answer. So you want this high level, but you also want the components that are at the bottom. Maybe it's the workers at a company. When there's something that they realize that the higher level, it's not part of that worldview, or because they have a set way of doing things that they're making decisions according to, or if it's like a cultural change or something that the bottom up, basically it's kind of like this chaotic process where there might be a change in culture and it spreads through the workers, and that should influence the higher levels, and it should allow for like a restructuring of those higher levels. And if the system doesn't do that, then it's not optimally adaptive. Of course, you don't need that to have a successful company. You can have, let's say like some executive level where they're not really paying attention to the
Authoritarian.
to the feedback they're getting from the lower level, or they just have their own way of doing things, like an authoritarian country like China's government. And basically, those systems can work very well in a certain sort of regime, a certain way of doing things. But if external circumstances change and society changes and those systems can't adapt, they're going to be in trouble.
I like it. So that's actually two topics that I want to talk about. Let's quickly talk about that first, and then later we go back to the global brain. So with I remember you mentioned something about China, which in the Joe Rogan interview, which actually that was another light bulb moment for me thinking about organization. So what you said was, on a long term, these authoritarian regimes, they are probably not going to be as successful as egalitarian ones, because what happens is right? Integrated information processing power, which you kind of mentioned earlier on. That's cybernetics theory about information integration, which means correct me if I'm wrong, capability of a system or an organism to respond to change and new novel problems that it's faced with is correlated with the amount of its internal diversity of thought and the internal connections between the elements or components within that organism. For example, in the brain, you can think of how many neurons are connected with each other and how much diversity of thought you have within that brain. And the higher these two numbers are, the more successful the organism or superorganism or complex adaptive system is in predicting and problem solving when faced with novel new problems. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's great. I think the idea is a bit older than integrated information theory. So it really goes back to evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith in maybe like the 70s and 80s. Gave this definition of complexity. But what integrated information theory does is it has this, measure called phi that allows us to actually have a number where we can try to measure the complexity of a system based on these ideas. But John Maynard Smith said complexity is really a function of two things. If we're trying to judge like how complex a system is, it's a feature of how many parts there are in the system and how integrated those parts are, how many connections there are between those parts. But it's not just about the number of parts. It's also about, as you said, the diversity of the component parts. So you could imagine a chemical system having basically like one or two types of molecules, like only carbon and hydrogen. You wouldn't be able to form life with just one or two molecules. So you need this distribution of molecules because the molecules will then play something like a division of labor. So whether it's organic system where you have all these different molecules interacting, or you have an organism that has all these different cell types. I think the human body has something like between like 200 and 300 different types of cells. And you could think about a functional society. A society wouldn't do well if everyone in the society had the same knowledge, or if everyone was the same, everyone was a doctor, or if everyone
Mhm.
was an artist, or even an engineer. It wouldn't be a very functional or adaptive society. So
Mhm.
you want diversity among the parts. And at these higher levels, when we're talking about societies, that diversity, that idea of needing diversity, also extends into a diversity of ideas. So
Mhm.
you want these ideas coming from the bottom up. People having good ideas, and then those ideas spreading and influencing the structures at the top that are making the decisions. And with a
Mhm.
system like China, where you have a situation where people can't really criticize the current system. So they have a social credit system where people will be penalized if they speak out against the current system. It's not a very adaptive system. Like I said
Mhm.
earlier, you can have very productive societies in this way because they've found a way. They've found sort of like a worldview and a way of doing things that works really effectively, but it won't be robust to environmental change over the long run.
Mhm.
And Russia, for example, a country where they don't allow independent journalism. They just have this
Mhm.
state-run journalism. You don't have this diversity of ideas.
Mhm.
So diversity is great, interconnection is great. Coming together to make this larger, maybe something like a global government is
Mhm.
good, but you want to preserve the individual nations and cultures at the same time, because you don't want everything to merge and have this kind of homogenous hive mind that would be like the Borgs on
Yeah.
Star Trek. You want constant, turnover of new ideas. So you
Yeah.
want a collective, but you want the units to maintain their integrity at the same time.
Absolutely. And when I think about authoritarianism and forcing people to think the same way, we have propaganda or the social credit systems, the result is compliance. So everyone is compliant. Okay. Say in Nazi Germany, you would either be a fascist, a Nazi, or you'd be dead, right? So
Yeah.
there's big incentives to think that way, right?
Yep.
And these ideas is when you have a compliant social structure, be it a country or an organization, on the short term, you may be able to achieve something very specific really
Hmm.
quickly and effectively towards a specific goal. But once we have on a long term, or if things change really quickly, or if that specific goal is not relevant anymore, we can't adapt as easily because diversity of division of labor, that's one thing, but also diversity of thought, as you mentioned, because different perspectives, you just need to bring the different perspectives, different people from different various backgrounds and religions and ethnicities and life experiences and philosophical views about the world, because different perspectives gives people different pathways to new ideas. And that's super important. I mean, organizations, we talk about diversity all the time because we want to be fair to disadvantaged people in society and various other reasons, and we want to have an equal number of women and men. Those are really good reasons, but also on if you think about the bottom line and profit, there's also a really good reason to have that diversity, because that diversity increases our computational power in an organization, and it's going to make the organization more adaptive to change.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, it's fair, but it's also very practical.
Mhm.
And as you said, these other countries with these more rigid systems, if they have a goal, they can achieve that very quickly. And it may seem like that's the good thing, but the world's this chaotic, noisy place. And your goal will change. Your goals will have to change because everything else around you is changing, and those systems won't be as robust to change. Um, China's interesting though because there's this ideology in Eastern society of the interdependent whole. And it's basically that, the idea, which is correct, like we've just said, that, we're all part of a society that's this larger superorganism. And so I think China has done well because that's a very important and sort of progressive idea. It's something that's in line with complexity science. The problem is they've used that to kind of have this mindset of, we don't, want individuals, like, think
Mhm.
about the greater good, but they kind of say they're the ones that decide the greater good.
Mhm.
Their way of doing things, their government. So I do think we all kind of can learn from China and that philosophy that we're part of this interdependent whole. But there's this other part of the story that's about the diversity that's necessary among the component parts to have a functional and adaptive system. So that changes the picture to one that you just explained, where we do value these differences of idea, differences in cultural background, all of those things.
Absolutely, absolutely, love it. So one of my biggest takeaways that I took from that conversation that you're having with Joe Rogan, that what we're talking about now is at my role, I focus a lot on what we try to achieve is change the behavior of the organization, superorganism, by changing people's minds, the mindset of people, by changing the underlying structures within the organization and the underlying subsystems of the organization, which drive certain behaviors in the organization. My takeaway was I need to add two more, which is probably a lot more effective. One is encourage diversity of perspective and thought, and the other one is make connections between people that normally don't work together closely. Maybe they don't know each other at all, or even if they know each other, they don't work together on a daily basis. So encourage that daily collaboration from different parts of the organization.
Yeah, I think those are great fundamental principles that you can't go wrong with. And yeah, it's an area that I'm looking to learn more about and to apply these principles. So the principles that you've identified in your book are really intriguing to me, and look forward to learning more from you about those in the future. But we
Great,
are these
thank
feedback systems. Earlier, you mentioned loops, and we are completely loops with levels, I say in the
you.
book. So as systems that have to stay far from thermodynamic equilibrium, we are this metabolic loop. We're always taking in
Mhm.
energy and dissipating that energy and turning it into entropy. And we're also informational loops because we have this stored model of the world in our genome and in our brain, and um, that model doesn't stay the same. So we're interacting with the world all the time, and our interactions with the world are basically like miniature experiments. And based on the results of those actions, those experiments, we update our model to be more
Mhm.
accurate of society. And if we don't do that, we're not adaptive, and we're not going to be functioning optimally in our
Mhm.
society. We're not going to be able to achieve our goals as well. So, yeah, understanding ourselves as loops that use these feedback mechanisms, these cybernetic systems, is really
Mhm.
important too.
Love it. Now let's do something. We have some questions and comments. We go through them quickly, and then we close the loop back to where we started, talking about maybe the global brain and your hypothesis about the future of cosmos and purpose of life and things like that. How about that?
Great. Love it.
Sounds good. So we have a few comments. People enjoying the conversation. We have one which says, incredibly interesting knowing what you know. What would be the best way of individuals to affect the climate change issues for positive action?
Okay, great question. My answer might be a little abstract, but I think we need to create this awareness. I think awareness is kind of the first step in this, and there are a lot of people out there trying to create awareness. And I know society is really divided right now, not just
Mhm.
in America, but across the globe. And that's a big problem because people have these ideologies, and these ideologies are their worldviews, and worldviews are basically um, like genetic programs, which are, you could see them as encoding world models that are strategies for survival. So worldviews
Mhm.
are strategies for collective survival. And our worldview is our way of making sense of things. It's our sense making lens. So when we hear something that goes against our worldview, we get threatened, and we cling to our worldviews more strongly. So if it's someone who doesn't believe that climate change is a problem, and they're being fed all this information that it's some sort of hoax or something, and you're trying to convince them, it's really hard to do that, and it might actually push them further away. So
Opposite, absolutely.
yeah, and so I think part of the answer is kind of you know, teaching this evolutionary story as the story of science, that life basically has this goal, this intrinsic goal of persisting in
Mhm.
a chaotic, fluctuating world. And one principle in the book that I didn't mention that kind of explains why these agents will form these larger functional structures, societies or corporations or, whatever, is because coming together, working together, makes your task easier
Mhm.
because there's this effective synergy. And that means, your energy extraction task I was talking about, you know, you have to eat food to survive, but the collective needs to extract energy to maintain all of this structure that we have that also protects the ordered state. So,
Mhm.
fossil fuels, solar power, all of that is also extracting energy from the surroundings to stay far from equilibrium.
Mhm.
So, if we have an ideology that basically says that we have to work together because we have to exploit the full computational power of the global brain in order for us all to survive and for our children to survive, then we see that coming together is not a luxury. It's something that we have to do
Mhm.
for our civilization to survive.
Mhm.
So I think awareness becomes an easier problem when you have this evolutionary story and this story of emergence that sort of gives purpose and meaning to life. And maybe that can build a bridge between, secularists and conservatives, um, because it has this sort of spiritual story without getting
Yeah.
into anything supernatural. It's this story of life, um, basically surviving, and complexity and intelligence and
Mhm.
creativity spreading. And so, yeah, maybe the awareness, the approach to that should be more about this
Mhm.
evolutionary story that really makes it clear that we're all in this together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to add to that, you kind of touched on it too, that the best way to change someone's mind is not via logical arguments. You can't win someone over by having a logical argument if they have a different worldview and if they're getting more defensive when that worldview under attack. I think a more effective way is with love, basically, right? So you
Yeah.
win them over with by being nice to them and by being friendly and helping, just being a good person, being a good neighbor and a good friend. And the actions are going to change people's minds and change people's hearts. Another way I think on an individual level we could be effective fighting climate change is just by consuming less. If we don't have to buy something, if we can, consume less, get organic when possible, just grow your own food if you have a backyard or anything like that, I think that would be also effective.
Yes, we always want to be efficient with how we use our energy because there are limited supplies, at least with the energy that we have the potential to unlock right now. So life is always striving to be more efficient with energy, and we have to recognize that principle and do that as a society. And also this idea of love, which some people might find kind of like idealistic or maybe too abstract, but I think that term really encapsulates this interconnectivity that is this main feature of the human network and the biosphere as a whole. So if the pandemic and the financial collapse of 2008, we saw that none of us live in these little isolated worlds. Everything we do affects everyone else, and it's kind of a shame that we had this message of love with the Beatles and John Lennon and the hippie movement, and it became a sort of cliche. And I think we need to reverse that, because even though it's simple, it's a very deep truth. And yeah, I think that's basically how we reasoning logically, like you said, can sometimes push the other side away. So we need love, as generic as it sounds, and we also need to try to align interests. So
Mhm.
we need to see where we agree on these big issues, such as I think the right and the left can both agree on at least the people, maybe not the politicians because they're part of this game, but the people can agree that like money is a corrupting influence in politics.
Mhm.
I think capitalism has a lot of good features. Corporations competing are just like organisms competing, and through that competition you get progress. And
Mhm.
so that's really important, but the problem with capitalism is that the people at the top start to be able to start to influence the actual laws of capitalism. So they
So
start to
then,
fund campaigns that change the laws in their favor,
mhm.
and that kind of yeah, destroys this evolutionary process that normally would be beneficial.
So it won't be
So
capitalism anymore. It would be regulation, but for the benefit of the companies rather than.
yeah, you could have these kind of hybrid systems where it's a mix of capitalism and socialist policies, but maybe something completely new. So the
Mhm.
decentralization movement we're seeing with blockchain
Yeah.
and crypto is really interesting, and that's more technology that connects us peer to peer. So it's like
Mhm.
forming more synaptic connections
Mm.
in the global brain, and then we can have a new mechanism of crowdfunding. So
I
you
like it.
can use NFTs to, yeah, you can use NFTs to basically raise funds for any sort of project that you have, and anyone can do it. So it kind of
Mm.
opens up the capitalist
Yeah.
system to everybody.
I really like that idea because, when a lot of people are defending capitalism in countries like the US or other countries, the argument is the government should not interfere with the market. But the fact is, the government is interfering with the market, even in the capitalist societies. It's just interfering for the benefit of certain companies, certain groups of people. And by going to that, utilizing that blockchain technology, we may be able to stop that interference or reduce that interference. I really like that idea. Now, let's look at this one more question, which kind of brings us back to that global mind. So we have this question: would you agree with the Gaia theory that Earth is an organism and potentially using humans to spawn, reproduce to other planets? Which kind of brings us back to the main idea in the book.
Yeah, great question to end with. I do. I believe in the Gaia theory, and I think it's gotten a bad rap and very unfairly. So the Gaia theory was created by a biochemist in the 70s named James Lovelock, and he was inspired by cybernetics and this idea that, these systems, you have these adaptive systems at different scales, and they use feedback to maintain their organization. And it became very clear that the planetary biosphere as a whole is self-regulating. So the biosphere keeps the global temperature in a range that's friendly for life, and it also keeps the gas composition in a range that's friendly for complex life. And we have mass extinctions, we have these events that disturb that dynamic equilibrium, but then you see basically these systems emerge again, and they're more robust than they were before that extinction. So you can see these.
So there's a purpose to the extinction too.
Yeah, the extinct, exactly. So that's what's really cool about it. Kind of psychedelic is that, yeah, these extinction events and, all of these challenges that nature presents us are basically things that force life to um, live up to the challenge, and it filters out the suboptimal or dysfunctional designs of life, whether they be organisms or corporations. And so the term Gaia wasn't even created by the inventor of the theory. He was neighbors with William Golding, who was the author of the book Lord of the Flies. And he thought this would be a good kind of flowery name. And so a lot of people were turned off just by the idea that Gaia is this name of this goddess from Greek mythology. And they kind of were arguing against the real idea, which was just basically saying that the biosphere was a cybernetic integrated system. So, yes, the planet itself is a superorganism because it goes beyond the biosphere. The biosphere works with these different Earth systems, so it's not just living things that are part of this. It's everything. And uh, when um, when humans leave the planet to terraform Mars, for example, which is a big project that we have SpaceX. People want to get off the planet. That's part of this process as well. And you can see that as our biosphere self-replicating. So the biosphere is an organism at this higher level. And when it terraforms another planet, because for life to exist on Mars, we have to start creating an ecosystem. We have to start putting plant life on there because we need it. We need an atmosphere that supports us. So you get replication, but because each planet is different, you also have variation. So you have replication with variation, and maybe at some point those societies on these different planets will compete, and then you have all of the ingredients for evolution through natural selection.
Wow, love it. That's crazy. So basically, the idea is we may have a global brain right now, which may not be conscious as well, but it may be becoming conscious because of the technology like internet and all the other technologies that are making us more and more connected and creating those feedback loops, which may create consciousness. If I'm remembering correctly, in your book or in one of your interviews, you said we cannot compare this to a human brain because the number of synaptic connections in a human brain is far greater than the number of connections that we could have in between humans or organisms on Earth. But it may not be the right comparison because you just need the right feedback loops to create that conscious. At the moment, it may be subconscious. It may become conscious later on. And that global brain may help us further make it easier for us as not just humans, but as a biosphere to reproduce into other planets and potentially other galaxies, right?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting line of thought, and yeah, it's not necessary exactly if the levels work differently and have different numbers of components, but it would be really interesting if the global brain did start to evolve to mirror a human brain. I think I was having this discussion with Michael Shermer, and mentioned that there's like I don't know how many people there are on the planet. Is there like 8 billion? It's something
Around that, yeah.
between like six and 8 billion.
Yeah.
Um, and there are 80 billion neurons in the brain, all connected to each other by 10,000 connections. And we're all becoming connected to each other. So maybe there
So
is something
80
like that.
trillion.
80 billion.
So 10,000 connections each. So it means how many connections? So it's 80 trillion?
Yeah, I think
80
that's right.
trillion connections.
And so Michael Shermer mentioned, like, what if, there's going to be like 80 billion people on the planet all connected in the same way? That'd be a pretty crowded place. But now that you mentioned it, there are all these devices. So there's the
Mhm.
Internet of Things, and these devices are also
Processing.
these, yeah. So there probably is something close to the amount of neurons in the brain. How interesting would that be if the human brain is mirrored at this higher level? And
Mhm.
then who knows how far the story goes? We're talking about life spreading through the solar system. What if it goes beyond that to
Mm.
galaxies and to the universe as a whole? One of the, I guess, the kind of culmination in the book is this idea that maybe something like a cosmic mind is
Mhm.
the ultimate culmination of this process.
Mhm.
Some very respected physicists like Paul Davies and complexity scientists like
Mm.
Stuart Kaufman have entertained this idea, and I think it's really neat to think about.
That's crazy because, as you said, we will be creating diversity as life evolves differently in different locations, and that diversity and more connections over, say, millions of years, for example, could create a cosmic mind. Now, another interesting thought was your hypothesis, which is about how universe is life friendly and how universe, in a way, I'm hesitant to use the word design, but in a way, it's designed to uh, make sure life happens and proliferates across the universe. Uh, but it's not necessarily us. If we can't make it, other planets or other lives or in other places in universe, life would arise. So the universe is inherently biophilic, not biophobic, right?
Yes, that's the idea. And so, origin of life research that has been informed by this thermodynamic story, non equilibrium thermodynamics, um, has basically come to the consensus that if you have the right ingredients on a planet, so if you have sufficiently similar geochemistry to the Earth, you have a wet, rocky, sunny planet, that life will emerge. And so, this won't
Mm.
be on all planets, but it won't be as rare as once thought. And then after life emerges, if you buy this story that I propose in the book, where um, it's sort of this natural thing for these organisms to find these synergistic collective configurations because it makes their energy extraction task easier, then you get inevitably these evolutionary transitions that end with something, culminate in something like global brain at the scale of a planet. So also the fact that life is adaptive complexity, so it's always self-correcting. So you can't kill life. You just keep hitting it with challenges. I mean, life has been around on this planet for around 4 billion years and hasn't blinked
We
out
may
once.
die, but life will not, right?
Life won't. And I think the more the biosphere progresses and produces intelligent agents like us, the farther the less it has to restart over
Mhm.
as with some sort of kind of disaster. So there are a lot of people out there who think humans are doing all of this you know, terrible damage to the planet. But if you think about it, intelligent life is the only thing that could stop, for example, a giant asteroid from colliding with the Earth and wiping out all complex life.
Mhm.
We can do that with technology.
Yeah.
And so
And
I think this trend is happening other places in the universe, and that basically this is an inevitable process, that adaptive complexity, that life is somewhat like an AI in that it's kind of like a chess playing program that doesn't know how to play chess at first, and it keeps playing
mhm.
other players that are better than it, and it keeps losing and
Yes.
losing, but it's storing and
Mhm.
encoding these patterns, and over time it becomes unbeatable.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's fascinating. And the flip side of it is, if we think us, we are part of nature as well. And maybe we are the way nature is doing its sixth mass extinction on Earth, right? It's using us, for example, if we buy that climate change is going towards a mass extinction. And that's fine, right? Maybe that's the way that that's the next challenge for life and biosphere to solve and come up with a better version and more smarter, more intelligent version of humans.
True.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think you recognizing that right now is also part of the process,
Mhm.
and that as the challenge becomes more of a threat, and
Mhm.
actually we start feeling the effects of it, that will create this sort of impetus for
Mhm.
society to become more aware and do something about it. So, baked into this evolutionary process is this kind of dialectic where there's this kind of nature poses a challenge to itself, essentially, and nature starts to model itself through life. And you can see this story not as life starting to dominate the universe. You can look at it as the universe itself waking up through life, and that it just does it through this kind of yin and yang type process.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Now, I think it's a good time to end, but before we end, I just want to let everyone know that definitely check out Bobby's book. It's available on Amazon, and Bobby also has a YouTube channel. Sorry, what was the name of your channel, Bobby?
Yeah, it's called Road to Omega, and there's a Substack as well. And it
Hmm.
basically takes the principles from the book and tries to apply them to society. I haven't published anything for a while, but I'm about to make that my focus. And we're going to be talking about a lot of the stuff that we've discussed today in the second half of this. And I would love for you to come on the channel and to interview you and learn
Oh,
more about
definitely.
organizational structure and how that all fits into this larger evolutionary picture.
Absolutely would love that, Bobby. So Omega is referring to Omega Point, right? For anyone who's
Yes.
interested.
So anyone who is a fan of philosophy and the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin, he thought
Mm,
the planet was moving toward this integrated state that he called a noosphere. And so he
mm,
basically predicted the emergence of the internet, before the internet was conceived.
mm. Absolutely. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show, Bobby. Any final words before we end?
Nope. Just wanted to say thank you so much for having me.
Right.
All the questions were amazing. And if anyone purchases the book and emails the screenshot of the receipt with their address to the romanceofreality@gmail.com, I'll send a signed and numbered, like a limited edition book plate so my publisher will mail that to you. And it's a sticker that goes inside the book kind of as a thank you for supporting
Oh,
me.
that's really good. Loving it. Great idea. Now, I want to end with this poem from Sadi, who was a Persian philosopher and mystic 800 years ago or so. And my translation may be terrible, but it goes something like human beings or children of Adam are organs of the same body. And I think, it's just so much similarity with this
I
poem that
absolutely
I
love
just
it.
talked
My
about.
my father's Persian, so I'm half Persian, and
Okay.
Bobby comes from Babak, actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'll have to
I
look him
love
up.
it.
I'm a fan of Rumi and Omar Khayyam, but I
Oh,
hadn't heard of
perfect.
Sadi.
Sadi, yeah,
Sadi.
he's amazing. He's really good. I mean, Rumi is number one, definitely, but yeah, Sadi is amazing too.
Wonderful,
Great.
love it.
Thank you so much, Bobby, and thanks everyone for watching.
All right, I'd love for you to have me back sometime.
Definitely we will.
Thanks for the great questions as well.
Thank you.